Well, before I start, I have a confession to make. This is a leftover sermon that I've done before. My hope is that it's kind of like when you make soup and then the leftover soup's even better the next day. That's my hope. So maybe you're getting the better one. I don't know. But this sermon came about because Reverend Joel, who's a minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Muncie, asked if I would be interested in doing a sermon on Unitarian or Universalist theology or history. And I thought, I'm not really qualified to do that. I've been UU for like 3 months. He loves to give out homework. But I thought about it, and in truth, I've been interested in Unitarian theology for a while. I've shared in my last sermon, I was raised in a biblical literalist tradition. Don't worry, I got better. So in my late teens and in my early 20s, when I started to really take my faith seriously, I read the Bible for myself, and I did notice it doesn't explicitly mention that God is a Trinity, that common Christian belief. So how does this Christian theological view become so dominant without actually being found in the Bible? Well, traditionally, Christians would point to some certain verses, and one of them is Matthew 28, and they would use that to support the view of God as a Trinity, or three equal persons, but one God. So this text is part of a passage called the Great Commission, and it's an account of Jesus' parting words to his disciples. And the text says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always till the end of the age." So most Christian people read that and they'll go, well, see, even though they don't use that word Trinity, the concept is right there. There's a Father, there's a Son, there's a Holy Spirit. But during the Protestant Reformation, which was a time when people were starting to get access to the Bible written in their own language for the first time, some would look at these passages and they would see them with fresh eyes. And they'd say, well, this doesn't explicitly say that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are God, just that they are. Now, I might have lost some of you in all that. Why? Well, for us gathered here today, many probably don't believe that classic Unitarian doctrine that God is one. In a UU church, we may have atheists. They don't believe that God is three in one, or three, or one, or any of it. We also could have some folks who are more open-minded Christians who still think that doctrine of the Trinity has meaning for them. We probably have some people that imagine the ultimate truth of the universe involving multiple gods or divine beings. We may have agnostics who aren't sure enough about God to even bother with some of these questions. And we probably have some mystics among us who are less concerned about believing the right things and more concerned with experiencing the divine. And I would imagine we have some Unitarians. And we probably have someone that doesn't fit into any of the categories that I mentioned, and they're still valued and welcomed in this community. So my question today is, are we still Unitarian? Does it matter? Do we need to go out and change the sign outside? We could be Heartland Super Awesome Open-Minded Church. So to discuss this, I have to talk a little bit more about Christian history, and what follows will be brief and oversimplified because no one wants to hear me drone on about that. And if you did, you're probably the kind of person that knows a lot of this anyway. But Christianity has actually always been diverse. I think the way it's presented is that people imagine the early leaders of Christianity united and always getting along and preaching about Jesus and helping the poor. And that happens sometimes. But even in the pages of the New Testament, there's evidence of conflict between those who are trying to make sense of this new faith. Just a couple examples. Galatians chapter 2 mentions conflict between Peter and Paul, two of the leading founding voices. Or Acts 5 and Romans 14 both present evidence that there were lots of disagreements among these early Christians on how Jewish the early Christian faith should be. Now, I don't bring this up to claim that the New Testament is a perfect historical source, but because they wouldn't have written about conflict if it wasn't there, right? They would have wanted to present themselves in the best way. This shows that early Christianity was never united to the extent that it's often presented. There was this conflict about what it meant to follow Jesus. And church history is often taught that there was this Orthodox group that got everything right, and they were constantly defending their faith against heretics. But what history shows us is that there were the always diverse ideas competing for dominance. There is no Orthodox faith. What became Orthodox were just the ideas that were the most popular, the ideas that won. And so the Trinitarian view of God became official doctrine of Christianity in the year 325 CE at the Council of Nicaea. At this council, the perspectives of Arius, who believed who believed Jesus was subordinate to God the Father and was not co-equal to God, were debated with the perspective of Athanasius, who believed the Father and Son were equally divine. Now, the council sided with Athanasius because they didn't believe Jesus or God the Son would have been able to save humanity from sin if he was not equally as divine as the Father. So we didn't get this doctrine of the Trinity from a verse that says this is how God is. It was the work of people in community trying to make sense of their faith. Now, some might wonder why this view isn't in the Bible then if they agreed upon it. But actually, the Bible wasn't canonized until 382 CE, so a few years later after they decided the Trinity. So probably not everyone in attendance even was reading the same Bible or the same holy text. They might have had disagreements on what books were actually would have belonged, but that was for another time to decide. And it's also worth noting that there was the influence of the Roman government on this council. They needed a united church to unite their empire around. Now, I'm not comfortable speaking definitively to the motivations of those who's passed a long time before me, but I believe the sake of the empire may have been prioritized over an honest search for truth, which is something we still see today. It's also important to note that Nicaea was not the only council that dealt with the Trinity, and that Christian ideas about the nature of God continued to evolve. A notable example is that the original Nicene Creed includes belief in the Holy Spirit, but doesn't really go into detail about how the Holy Spirit is related to the Father and Son. So this was worked out later in history. And what I want you to see is that these were evolving views over time. They weren't just handed down, but they evolved as people thought about these different issues. And so in any case, the Trinitarian view became the accepted view of Christianity, that there was one God who exists in three persons, a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit. And they believed that they shared the same divine nature and they were equal in divinity. So we have to ask what changed with those early Protestants. Well, I briefly mentioned earlier that the Protestant Reformation was in many ways started by the invention of the printing press. The printing press made literature more available. The Bible could be translated into common languages, and more people became able to read. The availability of the Bible challenged the church's authority. So a great example is the story of Menno Simons. He later became the namesake of the Mennonites. He became a priest in the year 1515. He was ordained as a priest, but he had never read the Bible. He did read it 2 years after being ordained because he became curious about some specific doctrines, and he ended up embracing the Anabaptist branch of Protestantism. So Simons was not a Unitarian, but his story illustrates the shift in authority that was taking place during the Reformation. Before the Protestant Reformation, authority was held by the leadership of the church. But as more people had access and were able to actually read the Bible, as literacy increased, this authority became more decentralized. And so today, sometimes people say, why are there so many Protestant denominations? And the truth is, anyone can read the Bible, declare their interpretation of it authoritative, and start their own church. And so the first people to challenge these traditional ideas about the Trinity, they were just attempting to be faithful Christians who were taking their faith seriously. An example of an early Unitarian is Michael Servetus. He published a book called On the Errors of the Trinity. Now, he believed that the Trinity was not a valid perspective because it was not explicitly in the Bible, as we've discussed, and he also thought it promoted the idea of three gods. Servetus believed that the Son, or the second person of the Trinity, was a manifestation of God, but not a separate divine person. But he was persecuted by both Catholics and other Protestants, and he was burned at the stake in 1553. So as I studied Unitarian history, there were many stories like this of people who were just trying to find truth, who cared enough about their faith to ask questions about it. They had this sincere faith in the God of Christianity, but they couldn't just simply accept what was handed to them. They often suffered for their beliefs, but their priority was a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. This is the part that I believe that Unitarian Universalists in central Indiana have inherited from these early Unitarians. We live in a different time. We have access to different information, but we come from a proud tradition of questioning authority and seeking truth. And so I think during this strange time we live in, this strange time when alternative facts have become mainstream, where the Department of Education is run by a wrestling character, and the 24-hour news cycle does less to inform us and more to keep us angry. This world needs truth seekers. Not truth seekers who impose their beliefs, but who do the sacred work of making space for deep thoughts and honest questions. Not truth seekers who arrogantly look down upon those who know less, but who seek to lift up and learn alongside others. Today, most of us probably don't share every belief that those early Unitarians held, but they started walking a path that Unitarian Universalists continue to walk today. It's a path that values truth and human progress. So today, may we ask hard questions without clear answers. May we read more books than we do tweets. And may we be encouraged by those who walked before us. And may we blaze a new trail for those who follow.